The border gate did not open easily. It protested with a low, rhythmic grinding that vibrated through the soles of Ruby Eliotra's boots and up into her teeth. She tightened her grip on the hilt of her sword, her knuckles white against the metal. The air here was thin, metallic, and tasted of ozone. Every inch of movement from the massive iron slabs felt like a deliberate challenge. Ruby held her position, muscles coiled, watching the sliver of space widen between the heavy panels. The groan of the metal deepened, a sound like tectonic plates shifting under immense pressure. She shifted her weight, feeling the uneven gravel beneath her feet, and focused on the dark, swirling void beginning to spill through the opening. The gate shuddered one final time, the hinges screaming as they reached the end of their track. Silence reclaimed the space, heavy and absolute, pressing against her ears. She exhaled, a slow, controlled release of breath, and braced herself for what stood on the other side. The path forward was clear, but the weight of her mission sat heavy in her chest. She stepped into the threshold, the sword steady in her hand, as the world beyond the gate began to stir. The space beyond the gate was not empty. It was a vacuum of shifting energy. A sudden heat wave rolled outward, smelling of sulfur and wet earth. Then, the shadows began to detach themselves from the ground. They did not walk. They coalesced. One form surged upward, its limbs flickering with the orange intensity of a forge fire. Beside it, another emerged, its body a constant, fluid cascade of liquid shadow that defied the laws of weight. The air temperature spiked, then plummeted, as frost crystallized on the ground where the water form stepped. They stood taller than any human, their shapes constantly folding into themselves and expanding again. Ruby stood her ground, but the heat of them scorched the air in her lungs. A third entity appeared, its surface glowing with the dull, pulsing rhythm of cooling magma. These were not soldiers. They were manifestations of raw, untamed forces. They did not speak, but the ground beneath them cracked under the sheer weight of their presence. The gate behind Ruby seemed small now, a fragile barrier against a tide that could not be bargained with. They watched her, their forms swirling in a hypnotic, terrifying cycle of destruction and creation, waiting for the first move. Far above the reach of the forest, the kingdom of Ethel held its breath. The floating cities hung in the thin, cold air, suspended by ancient currents that were rapidly losing their strength. From this altitude, the structures looked like silver needles embedded in the clouds, shimmering with a fading, pale light. But the shimmer was deceptive. A low tremor rippled through the central district, and the entire platform dipped, a sudden, sickening drop of several meters before the stabilizers kicked in. Smoke trailed from the propulsion vents, gray and sluggish against the blue expanse. Down in the streets, the hum of the machinery was erratic, stuttering like a dying heart. Every pulse of energy that failed sent a jolt through the foundations. The citizens felt the tilt, the subtle shift in gravity that reminded them they were living on borrowed time. Without the constant infusion of magical flowers to feed the core, the city was losing its grip on the sky. The spires groaned under the strain, the metal plates expanding and contracting with the temperature fluctuations of the high atmosphere. It was a masterpiece of engineering slowly turning into a tomb. Every passing minute pushed the city lower, drawing it inexorably toward the jagged horizon of the earth below. Below the shadow of the falling cities, the earth told the true story of the famine. The fields that once glowed with the vibrant, pulsing light of magical flowers were now nothing more than expanses of gray, cracked silt. Not a single petal remained. The soil had turned to hard-packed dust, resistant to the touch, devoid of the damp, rich scent that had once defined this region. Twisted, brittle stalks were all that broke the horizon, snapping into fine powder under the slightest pressure of the wind. There were no insects, no birds, no sound of life moving through the undergrowth. A scavenger team had passed through weeks ago, leaving behind rusted tools and empty crates that sat half buried in the sand, their purpose long since abandoned. This was the silent, sterile graveyard of the kingdom's power. Without the bioluminescent bloom to recharge the city cores, the land had simply ceased to produce. The desperation here was absolute, etched into every fissure of the dry riverbeds and the hollowed-out greenhouses. Ruby looked out across this expanse, seeing the stark reality that left her people with no other choice. They had stripped the land clean, and now the land was refusing to give anything back. The silence of the plains was heavy, a suffocating reminder that survival was no longer guaranteed. Ruby Eliotra reached the threshold of the border gate, her boots crunching against the dry, shattered earth. She stopped, her hand tightening around the hilt of her sword until her knuckles went white. She did not draw the blade, but she kept her stance wide, balanced for an immediate shift in momentum. The massive gate groaned, the iron bars vibrating as they slowly parted to reveal the territory beyond. Dust swirled into the air, caught in the sudden draft of a hostile environment. She looked past the threshold, searching for the movement of the guardians she knew were waiting in the shadows. There was no hesitation in her gait as she crossed the line of the old boundary. She stopped in the center of the clearing and extended her palms. A soft, amber light began to bleed from her skin, pulsing in rhythm with her steady heartbeat. The glow intensified, casting long, flickering shadows against the gnarled roots and dark trees that bordered the path. She held the light steady, a beacon of defiance in the dim, stale air of the forest. The ground beneath her feet trembled, responding to the energy she projected, but she did not flinch. She stood her ground, waiting for the forest to reveal its protectors, ready to force a conversation that might save her people from the sky. The air inside the clearing did not behave like air. It grew viscous and heavy, pressing against the lungs with every inhalation. As Ruby held her amber light aloft, the atmosphere began to warp, swirling into erratic pockets of high and low pressure. The three wind manipulators behind her reacted instantly. They stepped into a tight triangle formation, their feet digging deep into the loose soil to anchor their weight. Each of them raised their palms, pressing them firmly against the invisible currents of the air. The sound of rushing wind filled the clearing, a high-pitched whistle that vibrated in the teeth. They pushed back against the encroaching pressure, their arms straining to hold the chaotic gusts in check. Every time the air surged forward, they leaned further into the resistance, their muscles tensed and trembling under the strain. One of them stumbled as a sudden downdraft threatened to buckle her knees, but she caught herself, driving her heels into the dirt and re-establishing the seal. They were the only thing preventing the atmosphere from collapsing inward, maintaining a fragile bubble of calm around Ruby. The wind whipped around their fingers, visible only by the way it bent the dry stalks of grass. They stood motionless, their focus absolute, fighting to keep the sky from falling upon them while the border remained volatile. The violent resistance of the wind manipulators abruptly met a wall of absolute silence. The high-pitched whistle of the air currents died out, replaced by a stillness so profound it felt like the forest itself was holding its breath. From the depths of the shadows, movement rippled through the trees. The lead guardian stepped into the clearing, his presence causing the very ground to shift and reorganize. His skin rippled like water under a storm, glowing with the embers of a dying fire. He stopped 10 paces from Ruby, his stature looming over the group. He did not speak. He did not move to attack. Instead, his gaze swept over the humans, a slow, methodical survey that lingered on their presence in his domain. His eyes, burning with a cold, ancient intensity, appraised them with the detachment of a judge examining a blight. Every second that passed without a word stretched the tension to a breaking point. He watched the light still pulsing from Ruby's palms, then tracked the tremors in the hands of her team. His expression remained frozen in a mask of hard, unyielding judgment. He was calculating the cost of their arrival, measuring the damage they carried into his sanctuary. The air grew dense with the weight of his scrutiny, a silent condemnation that felt more dangerous than any weapon they had drawn. The silence shattered. The lead guardian opened his mouth, and the sound that emerged was not human. It was the slow, rhythmic grinding of tectonic plates shifting against one another. Every syllable carried the weight of stone. He pointed a finger toward the horizon, and the earth beneath the humans groaned in response. A deep crack split the soil, snaking forward until it swallowed the remnants of the Pegasus stables in a spray of dust and splintered wood. He took a heavy step forward, his eyes fixed on the metallic glint of the team's equipment. "Your metal machines have choked the sky," he roared, the vibration rattling the teeth of everyone present. He gestured upward, where the air shimmered with the heat of distant, invisible exhaust. He spoke of the soot and the oil that had stained the clouds for generations, his voice rising in a jagged, stony crescendo that seemed to shake the very foundations of the clearing. He did not ask for an explanation. He delivered an indictment. The ground continued to heave, the chasm widening as he detailed the suffocation of the atmosphere. He stood as a pillar of elemental rage, condemning the reliance on steel and fire that had brought the world to the brink of ruin. The echoes of his voice faded, leaving a hollow ringing in the clearing. Ruby lowered her blade, the tip scraping against the disturbed earth. She looked at her team, expecting to see defiance, but found only a mirror of her own sudden doubt. The three wind manipulators had pulled their palms back from the air. Their fingers trembled, no longer steadying the atmosphere, but clutching at their own sides. One of them looked up at the sky, tracing the dark, unnatural haze that lingered in the high air, the same haze the Guardian had just condemned. A heavy, suffocating realization settled over the group. It was not just the Guardian's power that kept them frozen, it was the undeniable truth of his words. The machines they relied on were indeed bleeding the world dry. Ruby caught the eye of her second-in-command, and the woman nodded slowly, a sharp, painful admission passing between them. The amber light at Ruby's fingertips flickered and dimmed, drained by the weight of the moral collapse. They had come to negotiate, but standing in the shadow of the man-made ruin, their purpose felt thin and dishonest. They stood shoulder to shoulder, no longer a strike team ready to attack, but a group of witnesses forced to acknowledge their own role in the dying light of the world. The stillness did not last. A sharp crack echoed through the clearing as the lead Guardian shifted his stance. The flowing water of his form abruptly hardened, turning into jagged, translucent ice that spiked outward with a sound like shattering glass. Beside him, the others mirrored this violent transition. Their embers, previously soft and pulsating, erupted into roaring, uncontrolled flames that licked the air and turned the surrounding foliage to ash in seconds. The temperature in the clearing swung wildly between freezing frost and blistering heat. Ruby felt the air pressure drop, then spike, as the wind manipulators beside her lost their grip on the local currents. The ground beneath their feet began to crust over with a layer of rime, locking their boots to the soil. The Guardians were no longer talking. They were manifesting their fury as physical law. A wall of fire surged forward, pushing the humans back toward the edge of the chasm. Ruby stepped away, her sword raised in instinct, but the blade vibrated as the air grew thick with static and smoke. The standoff had ended. The elemental fury was now the only language left in the clearing, and it was screaming for total dominance. Ruby stepped forward, placing herself between her team and the wall of flame. The heat singed the air near her face, but she held her ground. She raised her hands, the amber light pulsing weakly, a fragile barrier against the encroaching ice and fire. She took a breath, the air tasting of ozone and burnt wood. "Wait," she called out, her voice thin against the roar of the elements. She took another step, her boots crunching on the frozen earth. She needed them to understand. The cities are dying. Without the flowers, the foundations will fail, and thousands will fall. Her hands shook, the amber glow flickering in rhythm with her pulse. She looked directly at the lead Guardian, ignoring the ice shards that peppered the ground around her feet. "We are not here to take more than we need. We are here to survive." Her voice broke, a sharp, jagged sound in the heavy silence that followed her words. She pressed her palms together, trying to center her focus, trying to show them the desperation of her people. "Please, look at what we have become. We are reaching the limit. Just give us enough to keep the sky anchored." She stood waiting, her entire frame trembling, eyes locked on the shifting, inhuman forms before her. The lead Guardian did not look at her. He looked past her, toward the distant, humming towers of the city. When he spoke, the sound was not a voice, but the grinding of tectonic plates deep beneath the valley. Every word sent a vibration through the soil that cracked the surface further. He raised a hand, and the earth between them split, carving a jagged chasm that widened with every passing second. He pointed toward the city, his finger a jagged spike of granite. "Your survival is a parasite," the guardian rumbled. The words hung in the air like heavy lead. He gestured to the dying shrubs and the scorched earth at their feet. "You speak of anchors and sky, but you ignore the rot you leave behind. Every time your machines rise, the soil beneath us dies. You are not a part of this cycle, you are the interruption." He stepped forward, and the heat radiating from his form forced Ruby to stumble back. He was not negotiating. He was declaring an end to the era of human expansion. He turned his gaze fully onto her, his eyes like two pools of cold, stagnant water. The message was clear. The planet was no longer interested in sustaining the cost of their ambition. The bridge was gone, and the gap between them had become an uncrossable abyss. The finality of the refusal left no room for further words. Ruby saw the shift in the Guardian's stance. The decision was made. She did not hesitate. Her hand went to her side, gripping the hilt of her sword with enough force to turn her knuckles white. She looked back at her team. The three girls with wind manipulation abilities caught her gaze, their palms already hovering, fingers splayed to catch the rising currents. They were ready. The air between the two forces began to hum with a low, vibrating frequency that made the teeth ache. Static electricity danced across Ruby's skin, turning the fine hairs on her arms upright. She drew her sword, the steel ringing sharp and clear against the heavy, stagnant atmosphere. Opposite them, the Guardians responded instantly. Their forms flickered like dying embers, turning from fluid water into jagged, glowing stone. The ground beneath their feet began to smoke. Heat shimmered, distorting the space between the human lines and the ancient entities. Ruby braced her feet, shifting her weight to the balls of her boots. The hope of a peaceful resolution evaporated, replaced by the cold, hard reality of combat. Light gathered in her palms, swirling with a frantic amber intensity. Across the divide, the Guardians mirrored her stance, their collective energy coalescing into a blinding, raw power that threatened to ignite the very oxygen in the air. The standoff held for only a heartbeat. Then, the lead Guardian raised his right hand, fingers splayed wide against the horizon. He did not shout. He merely exerted pressure on the air itself. The ground directly in front of Ruby responded instantly. A deep, guttural groan rose from the bedrock, a sound of stone grinding against stone that vibrated through the soles of her boots. The soil rippled, buckling upward in a jagged, violent wave. Ruby tried to step back, but the earth beneath her feet dropped away, forcing her to lunge for balance. The crack started as a hairline fracture, then widened with a deafening roar. Dust and debris gazered into the air, obscuring the sky. The ground continued to tear, a jagged canyon of dark, raw earth snaking rapidly toward the rear of their lines. Trees on the perimeter were uprooted as the soil fell into the expanding void. The humans scrambled, their formation shattering as the very foundation of the battlefield disintegrated. Ruby braced her sword against the shaking earth, watching as the path they had walked upon was swallowed whole. The divide grew until it was 10 feet wide, then 20, a gaping, bottomless wound in the landscape. The Guardians remained motionless on their side, watching the chaos with eyes like cold, unblinking embers. The territory they had claimed was now physically severed from the world of men. The chasm did not stop. It carved a path of ruin, deep and relentless, cutting straight toward the heart of the royal perimeter. Ahead, the Pegasus stables stood as a final relic of the kingdom's pride. As the fault line deepened, the ground beneath the heavy oak foundations gave way. A sharp, rhythmic cracking echoed across the field as the wooden beams buckled under the sudden lack of support. Ruby watched, helpless, as the entire structure tilted toward the void. The roof, reinforced with heavy iron, groaned once before the support snapped entirely. The stalls slid downward, vanishing into the darkness of the gorge. Clouds of dust and splintered wood sprayed upward, momentarily blinding the soldiers nearby. There were no horses left to save. The creatures had fled hours ago, sensing the shift in the earth. Now, The space where they had been kept was nothing more than an open, jagged wound in the landscape. The loss of the stables marked the end of the old way of life. The kingdom's last connection to its noble tradition was gone, swallowed by the very earth the guardians commanded. Ruby stood at the edge of the collapse, watching the last remnants of the stable floor fall into the depths. The silence that followed was heavier than the roar of the destruction. The guardians shifted their focus, their forms pulsing with a cold, rhythmic light as they prepared for the next phase of their strike. The sky began to change. It was not the gradual drift of sunset, but a rapid, violent transition. Clouds that had been scattered in white curdled into dense, bruised purple masses, rotating in a slow, hypnotic spiral directly above the battlefield. The sun was choked out, its warmth vanishing in a matter of seconds. An eerie, metallic twilight descended, casting long, distorted shadows across the broken ground. Birds had long since fled. Now, even the wind died, leaving behind a suffocating stillness that made the air feel thick and heavy. Ruby looked up, her pulse hammering against her ribs, as the guardians raised their arms in unison. The light around their bodies intensified, shifting from embers to a blinding, crackling white. Each breath she took tasted like ozone and static. The atmosphere hummed with a low-frequency vibration that rattled her teeth and made the very ground beneath her boots feel unstable. It was no longer a skirmish. The guardians were drawing the life from the sky itself to fuel a final, devastating blow. She gripped her sword, knuckles white, sensing the sheer scale of the energy gathering overhead. The horizon vanished into the gloom, and the world narrowed down to the space between her team and the looming, radiant forms of the guardians. They were waiting for the signal to release the dark. The lead guardian stepped forward, his feet crunching on the fractured stone. He did not shout. His voice carried the weight of shifting tectonic plates, vibrating through the ground and up into Ruby's bones. "The machines have choked the sky," he stated, the words final and devoid of mercy. Ruby took a single, measured step forward, her palms open, the amber light at her fingertips flickering like a dying candle. She tried to speak, to offer a compromise, but her voice died in the heavy, static-charged air. The guardian ignored her outstretched hand. He looked past her, his gaze fixated on the smoking ruins of the city in the distance. He did not see a queen or a leader, he saw a parasite. The tension snapped. Ruby felt the shift in her own team behind her. The wind manipulators braced their legs, their palms pressing against the air with a desperate, frantic energy. The guardian slowly raised a hand, fingers splayed wide, and the earth began to groan in response. There was no more room for words. Ruby withdrew her hand, tightened her grip on the hilt of her sword, and felt the steel bite into her palm. She looked at her allies. They were ready. The last flicker of hope for peace vanished, replaced by the cold, mechanical necessity of war. With a synchronized movement, the soldiers leveled their blades. The guardians stood firm. The final moment of silence shattered. Ruby didn't wait for the order. She slashed the air, and a searing torrent of amber light erupted from her team, cutting through the gloom like a jagged blade. It slammed into the center of the clearing, intended to shatter the guardians' position. But the energy never reached them. As the light hit, the ground surged upward, twisting into thick, black vines that wove themselves into an interlocking lattice. Thorns, long as spears and sharp as glass, sprouted from the wood in an instant. The light hammered against the barrier, spraying sparks and molten energy across the mud, but the wall held firm. It drank the magic, the wood pulsing with a sickly, rhythmic glow as it absorbed the assault. Ruby lunged forward, her boots sliding through the churned earth, but a whip of thorny branch lashed out from the wall. She ducked, the wood grazing her shoulder, and felt the sting of 1,000 tiny needles. Beside her, the wind manipulators scrambled, their hands weaving frantic patterns in the air to deflect the incoming debris. The skirmish exploded into a blur of motion. Every strike of light was met with a new, defensive growth of thorns. The bridge was lost. The space between them turned into a churning, hostile thicket of living, aggressive wood. The air grew hot, filled with the smell of scorched sap and ozone. The clearing turned into a meat grinder of raw elemental force. Ruby pivoted, her blade humming as it sheared through a rising wave of stone. But the ground beneath her feet buckled. She jumped, landing on a protrusion of obsidian that cracked instantly under her weight. Everywhere, the sky pulsed with conflicting energies. Bolts of amber light crisscrossed the horizon, clashing against thick, surging roots that tore through the surface like breaching whales. The roar was deafening, a cacophony of grinding tectonic plates and the high-pitched whine of overtaxed steel. A massive surge of pressure slammed into the perimeter, sending a shockwave that leveled the remaining stone markers. Ruby saw one of her team members thrown backward, slamming into a wall of thorns that instantly constricted around them. She reached out, but the ground split again, forcing her to scramble backward just as a fissure opened, swallowing the space where she had stood a second before. Debris rained from the sky, heavy chunks of earth and metal tumbling through the smoke. The Guardians stood motionless in the center of the storm, their forms blurring as they channeled the very foundation of the world into their defense. The battlefield was no longer a place of combat. It was a collapsing void, a violent fracture in reality that threatened to erase everything within reach. The roar of the conflict hit a deafening final note, the very air vibrating with the pressure of colliding forces. Then, movement. Not the calculated strike of a warrior, but the frantic, uneven sprint of a child. Elara broke through the dense curtain of smoke and debris, her small frame cutting a jagged path toward the absolute center of the storm. She did not flinch as a bolt of amber light hissed over her head, nor did she stumble when a massive root hammered the earth inches from her feet. She ran with a desperate, singular focus. The combatants saw her simultaneously. Ruby's hand stalled mid-swing, the blade hanging uselessly in the air. The Guardians, their forms flickering with raw, volatile energy, shifted their gaze downward, the grinding roar of their voices dying into a sudden, confused silence. Elara reached the epicenter, the ground beneath her feet scorched and splintered by the preceding violence. She ignored the towering figures of light and stone surrounding her. She ignored the dying sparks of magic that still danced in the turbulent air. She crossed the final few paces of the crater, her movements small, fluid, and entirely out of place in the jagged wreckage of the battlefield. The world seemed to hold its breath. She stopped, stood for a heartbeat in the eye of the storm, and looked down at the ruined, broken soil. Elara lowered herself onto the jagged, fractured earth. She did not hesitate. Her knees met the scorched dirt, and she leaned forward until her forehead rested against the cooling soil. Around her, the sheer scale of the conflict seemed to shrink. The towering figures of the Guardians stood frozen, their shifting forms dimmed, as if waiting for a signal. The hum of the atmosphere dropped, the violent static that had choked the air for hours vanishing in a single, clean sweep. It was not just an absence of noise. The wind stopped moving. The debris suspended in the air simply drifted to the ground, settling into the dust without a sound. Ruby stood 10 paces back, the weight of her sword pulling at her arm, but she did not move. No one did. The silence was heavy, thick enough to feel against the skin. It pressed into the lungs, demanding a pause from the world. Elara closed her eyes. Her fingers dug slightly into the dry, cracked surface of the ground, as if she were trying to reach something buried deep beneath the ruin. She tilted her head, her lips moving in a soft, barely audible murmur that carried across the crater. She spoke to the earth, a whispered request that seemed to vibrate through the very bedrock. The world held its breath, waiting for the ground to answer. The response did not come from the sky. It ignited directly beneath Elara. A single, sharp point of emerald luminescence bloomed, where her forehead touched the soil. It was not the flicking, erratic light of magic, but a steady, deep-rooted glow that burned with the intensity of 1,000 suns. The earth groaned in protest, a low-frequency vibration that rattled the teeth of every soldier standing in the perimeter. Then, the light surged. It broke the surface in a violent, circular shockwave of emerald radiance. The pulse tore across the crater, moving with the speed of a snapping whip. It bypassed the laws of distance, washing over the debris-strewn battlefield in a heartbeat. Ruby braced herself, planting her boots wide as the wave hit her, the light passing through her body like a cooling breeze. The Guardians did not retreat. They stood tall, their shifting forms illuminated from within by the intense green current. Their faces turned toward the epicenter. The wave slammed into the outer perimeter, hitting the line of metal machines with a sound like shattering glass. Dust and grit were swept into the air, caught in the emerald wake. The pulse grew wider, brighter, and more absolute with every passing second, consuming the shadows and the scorched craters alike in an unstoppable tide of color. The impact against the machines was not an explosion, but a sudden, violent reclamation. Where the emerald wave touched the cold steel, the metal buckled and groaned. It did not melt, it twisted. Thick, knotted vines erupted from the joints of the war machines, splitting the iron plates as if they were nothing more than dry husks. Gears and pistons were forced outward, crushed by the rapid expansion of wood that surged up from the ground. A heavy, rhythmic, cracking sound filled the air, the sound of steel being shredded by the unstoppable force of life. Within seconds, the line of machines had vanished. In their place, tall, broad-trunked oaks shot toward the sky, their branches weaving together to form a dense, impenetrable canopy. The smell of ozone and burnt oil was instantly replaced by the scent of wet earth, pine, and deep, ancient moss. Roots burrowed deep into the soil, anchoring the new forest into the craters that had held the machines only moments before. Ruby stood amid the sudden growth, watching a sapling rise through the space where a heavy artillery piece had stood. The transformation was absolute. The mechanical threat was gone, buried under a layer of green that felt as though it had been there for centuries. The forest had moved in, and it had no intention of leaving. The emerald tide did not stop at the perimeter. It surged forward, a tidal wave of green light racing toward the gleaming spires of Ethel. The skyscrapers, once symbols of enduring steel, shuddered as the wave made contact. It began at the foundations. Where concrete met the earth, roots the size of cathedral pillars erupted, tearing through the pavement and spiraling upward. The building swayed, a terrifying, rhythmic motion that signaled the end of their structural integrity. High above, the glass windows shattered, not from impact, but from the pressure of branches bursting through the frames from within. Floors collapsed, but they did not fall into ruin. They were caught by an intricate lattice of woven wood that grew with impossible speed. The steel frames twisted, forced to bend into the shapes of massive, living trees. It was a transformation that defied every law of architecture. Entire floors were consumed, replaced by spiraling boughs and thick, leafy canopies that stretched toward the clouds. The skyline of Ethel, once cold and metallic, now rippled with the motion of leaves in a sudden, phantom breeze. Where there had been sharp angles and cold reflections, there were now soft curves and the deep, rich texture of bark. The city had been rewritten. It stood silent, a vast, vertical forest pulsing with the same emerald light that had birthed it. The transition was complete, leaving behind a horizon of living, breathing towers. The generals stood frozen near the edge of the crater, their eyes locked on the transformation of their city. They reached for their hilts, ready to command a final stand, but the emerald pulse reached them before a single order could be issued. It moved like a wave of heavy, humid air. As the light touched the plating of their armor, the cold, rigid metal began to soften. It did not melt away. It changed texture. The sheen of polished steel dimmed, darkening into a dull, brownish hue. Within seconds, the hard surfaces began to sprout. Patches of thick, damp moss bloomed across shoulders, breastplates, and greaves. The generals clawed at their own gear, but the metal had lost its structural integrity. It crumbled under their fingers, turning into a soft, fibrous carpet of green. The weight of their protection vanished, replaced by the damp, earthy fragrance of a forest floor. A commander grabbed for his sword, but the blade buckled, bending like a wet twig before snapping into fragments that fell to the ground. They stood exposed, their heavy gear now nothing more than a mantle of living moss. The transition left them physically vulnerable, their martial presence replaced by the sudden, quiet reality of their own mortality. They looked down at their hands, which were now stained with soil, and realized they were no longer warriors in control of a battlefield. They were merely spectators in a world that had reclaimed its own authority. The silence in the clearing was absolute. The human leaders stood amidst the remnants of their authority, staring at the moss that now coated their limbs. One general, his face pale and eyes wide, gripped the hilt of his sidearm. He tried to pull it from his belt, but the metal, now porous and brittle, disintegrated into a fine, dark dust that slipped between his fingers. He watched, trembling, as the last of his steel hit the dirt, instantly sprouting tiny, pale mushrooms where it landed. Across the line, his peers mirrored his motion. They reached for their weapons, only to let them fall to the ground with a soft, dull thud. There was no clatter of iron anymore, just the sound of heavy, useless gear hitting the soft earth. They stood motionless, their hands empty, palms upturned, as if testing the air for a threat that no longer existed. Their gaze shifted slowly toward the elemental guardians who hovered at the edge of the woods. The guardians did not move, their forms shifting like cooling embers. The human leaders looked back at their own feet, at the soil where their power had been buried. They were no longer commanders of armies. They were observers to a shift they could not fight. Every eye remained locked on the guardians, wide with the weight of a defeat that felt like a sudden, waking dream. The standoff ended not with a spoken surrender, but with a movement from the heart of the forest. The largest oak in the clearing shifted. Its thick, gnarled bark groaned, separating along a deep, vertical vein to reveal a smooth, amber-colored interior. One of the guardians stepped forward, his hand trailing a sharp, glowing finger across the exposed grain. He began to carve. The wood reacted instantly, darkening where the incision cut deep. The guardians worked in rhythmic silence, etching symbols that flowed and pulsed with a faint green light. Each line of the treaty was a mandate of silence, a promise of non-interference, and a strict 10-year term of peace. The human leaders watched, their heads bowed, as the laws of the forest were burned into the living surface. When the final character was set, the tree pulsed once, a low vibration that traveled through the souls of everyone present. The carved wood hardened, sealing the agreement into the heart of the tree. The guardians stepped back, their forms flickering against the dark foliage. The 10-year cycle had begun. No signatures were needed. The forest itself held the weight of the promise, and the humans stood as witnesses to a reality that could no longer be challenged. The terms were absolute, etched into the very life force of the world. Ruby stood alone by the massive oak, her sword point resting deep in the soft, mossy earth. She let her fingers slip from the hilt, the metal feeling strange and cold against her skin. She looked down at her hands. For weeks, the amber light had pulsed there, a bright, jagged reminder of her role in the conflict. Now, the glow was flickering. She watched as the sharp, golden edges of the light softened, diluting into the air like smoke caught in a breeze. She turned her palms upward, testing the weight of the change. A faint, steady, emerald hue began to bleed into the skin, replacing the harsh warmth of her earlier power. It felt cool, rhythmic, and quiet. She clenched her fist, and the green light pulsed in sync with the forest around her, moving as if she were breathing in time with the trees. The transition was not painful, it was a settling of debts. She spread her fingers wide, observing the way the green luminescence danced beneath her surface, mirroring the new life sprouting in the craters nearby. The amber fire was gone, leaving only the soft, enduring glow of a world that had finally stopped fighting itself. Ruby took a slow, deep breath, her hands steady, her purpose aligned with the quiet pulse of the emerging woods. The lead guardian did not look back. He turned toward the thickening tree line, his form blurring until he was indistinguishable from the shadows of the ancient canopy. One by one, the other guardians followed, their steps silent upon the damp forest floor. They moved with a fluidity that suggested they were not walking through the woods, but becoming part of them. Within seconds, The clearing was empty of their presence, leaving only the rustle of leaves in a wind that smelled of pine and damp earth. Ruby watched the spot where they had vanished. She turned to look at the human camp. The silence was absolute. No grinding of gears, no humming of engines, no distant thrum of heavy machinery. Only the sound of breath and the occasional snap of a twig. The kingdom leaders stood frozen, staring at the tangled mess of vines and twisted oaks that had once been their towering cities. They reached for tools that were no longer functional, their fingers brushing against cold, dead metal that offered no response. The era of convenience had ended. Now, they were left to navigate a landscape that no longer recognized their authority or their inventions. The forest did not wait for their understanding. It simply grew, closing the gaps between the trees and reclaiming the space where the machines had once stood. The world was quiet, vast, and entirely new. Ruby walked toward the largest crater, where a machine had once churned the earth into jagged iron teeth. She knelt, digging her fingers into the loose, dark soil. It was rich, damp, and smelled of potential. Nearby, a group of people who had once commanded armies now stood with their hands cupped, holding handfuls of seeds gathered from the forest edge. They approached the craters with hesitation, then moved with purpose. Elara stood a few paces away, watching as a soldier knelt beside a former rival, their shoulders brushing as they both pressed a small, brown seed into the cooling earth. They worked in silence. The ground that had been torn open by war now became a nursery. Ruby placed her own seed into a deep furrow, covering it with a layer of mulch. Around her, others followed, clearing away shards of metal to make room for roots. There were no grand speeches, only the rhythmic sound of hands moving through dirt and the soft rustle of wind through the new canopy. The jagged scars in the land began to disappear under the weight of their labor. As they stood, they looked at the soil, then at each other, their faces marked by exhaustion but grounded by the work. The world was fragile, yet it held life. They turned to the next crater, ready to plant again, sowing the foundation for a future built on growth rather than conquest.